Media in the United States seemed shocked at how swiftly the Taliban took control of Afghanistan as American troops withdrew from the country. Now, it's worth evaluating the failed US-led war in Afghanistan to really understand what its real objectives were. While the American people were sold this hollow story about building democracy, the mission was literally called Operation Enduring Freedom. In reality, capitalism and the redistribution of wealth from the bottom to the very top was the main driver and influencer behind the war. But that's not what goons like Tucker Carlson would have you believe, because he thinks that the war in Afghanistan failed for other reasons.
Over the past 20 years, for example, Congress has allocated close to $1 billion to export academic feminism to Afghanistan. Where'd that money go? Well, it went to programs like a 2-year master's degree in gender and women's studies offered at Kabul University, something Afghans apparently never knew they needed. Another U.S. government effort, meanwhile, funded, quote, activities that educate and engage Afghan men and boys to challenge gender stereotypes. Right, they weren't doing that enough. And of course, always and everywhere, our leaders enforced the most American of all cultural exports, affirmative action. American-funded gender advisors demanded that women compromise at least 10% of the Afghan National Army and a still larger proportion of that country's political leadership. Thanks to American-imposed gender quotas, dozens of women ultimately were installed as representatives in Afghan's parliament. How'd that work? Well, the whole thing was a sham, as always. In fact, many of these new female legislators had never been to the provinces they claimed to represent. Almost nobody in Afghanistan liked any of this, by the way, and why would they? As one USAID official conceded in a classified report, quote, focusing on gender made things more unstable because it caused revolts. It caused revolts. But officials kept doing it. They kept pushing radical gender politics anyway because they could, because they were in charge of these Stone Age people they were going to educate.
Now, of course, the war in Afghanistan didn't fail because the United States was exporting gender politics. But it did fail in that we did export weapons that lead to more of what the United States government claimed they wanted to prevent in countries like Afghanistan: terror. So look, right-wing populists tend to center their critiques on identity-related matters rather than how profit motives in American foreign policy toward countries like Afghanistan are really to blame for all of these failures, all of this suffering that we're now seeing on the ground in the country. In fact, America's desire to defeat Soviet control of Afghanistan is actually what empowered the Taliban in the first place.
To be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan. And we were successful. The Soviets left Afghanistan, and then we said, great, goodbye, leaving these trained people who were fanatical in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving them well armed, creating a mess, frankly, that at the time we didn't really recognize. We were just so happy to see the Soviet Union fall, and we thought, okay, fine, we're okay now. Everything's going to be so much better. Now you look back, the people we're fighting today, we were supporting in the fight against the Soviets.
Man, it is kind of nice to see Hillary Clinton have a moment of clarity and complete honesty in that interview. And, you know, it's worth exploring the profit motives behind the war and how these incentives actually make the world less safe by exporting, not ending, terror. Americans were sold all sorts of deceptions about the need to invade Afghanistan from the very beginning. First, they were told it was all about bringing Osama bin Laden to justice after the tragic events of 9/11. But then when the Taliban actually offered, they literally offered to hand over Osama bin Laden to a third country so the United States could try him to make sure he was guilty of the crimes he was being accused of, the Bush administration said, no, we're not going to take that offer. On October 14th of 2001, ABC News reported that the United States rejected yet another offer by Afghanistan's ruling Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden for trial in a third country if the U.S. presents evidence against bin Laden and stops their air attacks. We were already doing airstrikes at that point. Now, when explaining the administration's rejection of that reasonable offer, Bush made clear that he didn't believe in undergoing any process that determined without a reasonable doubt that bin Laden was the mastermind. And to be clear, bin Laden was the mastermind. We know that. So we should go through a process by an independent country that determines that so he can be brought to justice. Bush wasn't interested in that because his administration was far more interested in going even further than just airstrikes in Afghanistan. Instead, Bush wanted to go to war.
Bush deployed some 2,500 U.S. troops into the country, causing the Taliban to abandon Kabul and soon thereafter Kandahar, their main stronghold.
The Taliban were a broken force at that time. They gave up barely without a fight and melded back into society and retreated into villages. Some Taliban commanders actually offered to surrender in return for amnesty, but the US declined that offer and wanted to keep fighting them. They wanted to stamp out every last terrorist from Afghanistan. Instead, the Taliban regrouped in Pakistan, where they received shelter and support with the aim of returning later.
And as we all know, the Taliban did in fact return later, slowly gaining ground throughout the 2 decades America was literally fighting the war. It's incredible. In fact, even after Osama bin Laden had been captured, assassinated by the United States government under both under the Obama administration, both Obama and Donald Trump decided to keep troops on the ground.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda.
May 1st, 2011, Osama bin Laden, the man held responsible for the 9/11 attacks, was killed. And around that period, the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan hit a peak of around 100,000. The policymakers and experts began to question the effectiveness of that large military presence.
What became clear was that the US counterinsurgency strategy did not eradicate the Taliban. In fact, some of the more controversial tactics that the US used in Afghanistan, such as night raids and arbitrary detentions and airstrikes that sometimes killed civilians, created discontent in local communities and actually helped the Taliban recruit more fighters.
Now, again, the whole argument of troops on the ground in Afghanistan was that we need to build democracy. This is a nation-building exercise. And so the United States worked to prop up the Afghan government, right, as the response, as the substitute for the Taliban. But the facts on the ground showed that the United States actually wasn't making any progress.
The Afghan security forces were plagued by problems that continue to haunt them, such as corruption, which made them an ineffective fighting force against the Taliban, who continued to fight, allegedly armed and funded by Pakistan.
The Afghan government has acknowledged problems with effectiveness and corruption among its security forces, but told the Journal that corruption is decreasing. And Pakistan's government has denied backing the Taliban, but says it has some limited influence over the group.
And the weaknesses of the US-propped Afghan government were even more apparent this year. And the Taliban was quickly gaining ground in Afghanistan. It was easy. It was so easy to read the tea leaves. It was clear that the United States had failed in this mission because the mission of nation building wasn't the real intention in the first place. Again, it was easy to read the tea leaves.
On July 4th, 2021, U.S. troops finally left Bagram, their main base of operations in the country. Meanwhile, the Taliban's expansion accelerated.
And so we come to our current situation as U.S. troops have pulled out, and you see scenes that are chaotic on the ground in Afghanistan. You see people trying to flee. The Taliban has taken complete control of the country. Just last weekend, they took control of the capital, Kabul. And so Afghans, certainly saw the United States as an occupying force because the country had been occupied by US soldiers for 2 decades. There was no clear indication that the Taliban was losing power. In fact, they had gained power over those last 2 decades. And so the war was a failure from the perspective of working people. But the point of the war, again, was to redistribute taxpayer money here in the United States to the very profitable corporations, which is why 2 decades and $2 trillion later, we have nothing to show for in Afghanistan. In fact, all the United States did do was export terror by offering training and funneling weaponry to the Taliban. Now, they did it in an indirect way, but let me show you what I mean when I discuss the profit motives at play here. There was a great piece written in The Intercept by John Schwartz, and he argues that those who invested in defense stocks in the Afghanistan war actually got pretty significant returns. $10,000 invested in defense stocks when the Afghanistan war began are now worth almost $100,000. Let me give you a few snippets from this piece because it gives you a sense of how these defense contractors ended up outperforming the stock market. For instance, if you purchase $10,000 of stock evenly divided among America's top 5 defense contractors on September 18th, 2001, and faithfully reinvested all dividends, it would now be worth $97,295. This is a far greater return than was available in the overall stock market over the same period. $10,000 invested in an S&P 500 index fund on September 18th of 2001 would now be worth $61,613. Now, the piece argues that these numbers suggest that the war in Afghanistan was not a loss for some. And the people who actually won in this war are the very corporations that financially benefited from it. From the perspective of some of the most powerful people in the United States, it may have been an extraordinary success. Notably, the boards of directors of all 5 defense contractors include retired top-level military officers. And I do think that it's worth looking at a few of these defense contractors specifically to see what kind of returns their shareholders got during the 2 decades-long failed war in Afghanistan. Why don't we take a quick look at Boeing, for instance? The total return for Boeing, if someone invested $10,000 in the beginning of the war, is 975%, nearly 975%, an annualized return of 12.67%. Meaning that if you invested $10,000 in Boeing back in 2001, that purchase today will yield you $107,588. It's insane. And as one more example, why don't we take a look at what kind of contracts Boeing got as a result, government contracts Boeing got as a result of the Afghanistan war. Boeing's in situ subsidiaries secured a 3-year, $71 million contract from the U.S. Navy to produce 8 Scan Eagle unmanned aerial systems for Afghanistan through a foreign military sales agreement. Look, $71 million is not that much money in the grand scheme of things. My point in giving you that specific example is that throughout the entirety of the 2 decades-long war, these are the types of government contracts defense contractors were able to secure. And that money was returned to shareholders in the form of dividends, in the form of the stock value or the share values, I should say, increasing. Northrop Grumman is another example of that. The total return for investors of Northrop Grumman, 1,196%. It's incredible. So if you invested $10,000 in Northrop Grumman stock back in 2001 at the beginning of the war, you would see that money grow to a whopping $129,644.84. So it gives you a sense of how profitable war is, not just for the shareholders, but the executives of these corporations, of these companies. They have a literal financial interest in engaging in these forever wars, which is why I would argue we continue to have boots on the ground even after the United States assassinated Osama bin Laden. Remember, the whole point of going into Afghanistan was to bring Osama bin Laden to justice for being the mastermind of 9/11. After we did that, why were we still there? And it was because of the profit motive. And not only did it enrich these defense contractors, it also helped the very group that we were allegedly fighting in this quest for freedom. Just absolutely hollow nonsense that no one should have bought into. Now, so with the complete collapse of the Afghan National Army, all of that weaponry is in the hands of the very people the United States military was fighting in the first place.
In a recently overrun army base in northern Afghanistan, Taliban show off captured heavy weapons and ammunition. At times, the Taliban claiming wins without firing a shot. In Tahrir province, a whole column of up-armoured American-made Afghan army Humvees are surrendered by government soldiers to the Taliban. The soldiers dump their guns in a pile, a valuable boost for the Taliban, who are fighting hundreds of miles from their heartland in the south and east.
So that sophisticated weaponry is now in the hands of the very group that we were supposed to be fighting. And they're also selling some of that weaponry on the black market. Look, a lot of the U.S. military intervention that gets cheerleaded on cable news actually exports more terror. It destabilizes regions. And one might want to ask themselves whether that's intentional, because it perpetuates more war. It creates this never-ending cycle of U.S. intervention, which Americans get told is nothing more than us trying to spread freedom and democracy. That's what we genuinely care about. I mean, yes, we have cozy relationships with Saudi Arabia and other countries that are led by dictatorial regimes, but let's just ignore that and pretend as though the U.S. government cares about spreading democracy elsewhere. It's absolute garbage. So the Associated Press gave us some more details about the kind of weaponry that is now in the hands of the Taliban. Built and trained at a 2 decades cost of $83 billion, Afghan security forces collapsed so quickly that the ultimate beneficiary of the American investment turned out to be the Taliban. They grabbed not only political power, but also U.S. supplied firepower, guns and ammunition, helicopters, and more. In fact, the 83, just to give you a sense, let's juxtapose this to what Americans are getting at home. The $83 billion invested in Afghan forces over 20 years is actually slightly more than what Washington budgeted last year for food stamp assistance for about 40 million Americans. I don't know. I feel like that money could have been better used at home, especially since all we did was create more of a problem in Afghanistan. Now, experts told Vice World News, that rapidly falling weapons prices were evidence that the captured weapons that the Taliban now has were being sold on the regional black market, of course, to be used in all sorts of nefarious ways. Already, prices are dropping on the American-style M4 assault rifles and other weapon systems widely distributed to the Afghan National Army, said a Dubai-based security researcher studying the question on contract for regional governments who asked not to be named. He also says that the endless stockpiles of weapons seized by the Taliban as they took over the country will end up on regional markets because collectively Afghanistan is already awash in light and medium weapons. Another concern, by the way, for the region will be the status of the American-supplied Air Force. Not only do they have weaponry, they have other military materials, other military gear that they could either sell on the black market or use for themselves. In Mazar Sharif, for instance, Taliban fighters could be seen examining UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters at an A-29 Tucano attack plane, but with those planes relatively complex to operate, the real prize for the Taliban will be the Mi-17 Russian-made transport helicopters that have been long operated in the region. So now all of those sophisticated weapons that the Taliban did not have before we invaded Afghanistan are being sold on the black market, and they're being used by the Taliban themselves. And this is not the only way the United States exports terror, because we have a for-profit model when it comes to our foreign policy. And that's a huge issue. Now, I want to give you another case, but it's certainly related to the point that I'm trying to make right now. Remember Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist who was dismembered and obviously murdered in Istanbul a few years ago during the Trump administration? Well, we're learning more about the individuals who murdered him and where they got their training from. 4 Saudis, for instance, who participated in the 2018 killing of Jamal Khashoggi, received paramilitary training by the Arkansas-based security company Tier 1 Group, which is owned by the private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management in the United States, the previous year under a contract approved by the State Department. I mean, they got to make some money or to trade some Saudis. That's totally fine. Not a big deal as long as they're getting that nice dinero. And the instruction occurred as the secret unit responsible for Khashoggi's killing was beginning an extensive campaign of kidnapping, detention, and torture of Saudi citizens ordered by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, to crush dissent inside the kingdom. Operation Enduring Freedom. That's what we're all about, folks. Now, the bloated defense budget, of course, funds this garbage. Tier 1 Group was founded to train U.S. military personnel, taking advantage of an expanded Pentagon budget for military personnel training in basic counterinsurgency skills. But look, I mean, maybe we're being a little unfair. Maybe we're sitting back and we're looking at things in retrospect. It's real easy to do that. I mean, who could have seen all of this coming? Well, back in 1961, the United States President, Eisenhower, saw it coming.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
By the military-industrial complex. Those warnings should have been taken seriously. But when you live under a capitalist system where profit motive reigns supreme, where profit motives take priority over human lives, including the lives of people in your own country, these are the kinds of decisions that one can expect. And these are the kinds of decisions that are likely to happen again in the future, as long as there is a profit motive behind endless wars. And it's not just the Afghan people who are suffering the consequences of that today as a result of our weaponry being distributed to the very group of people that we were supposed to be fighting in the first place. The people of America suffer as well, as our bloated defense budget continues to get more and more funding, more and more approval for appropriations from Congress year in, year out. And all of those other social programs that people desperately rely on, they continue to be at stake, There are proposals to cut them. And honestly, no one wins except for a small group of people at the very top who are incentivized for more and more war. Nando. Oh, no. All right, you're muted, Nando. There we go.
1 second. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, my mic got... Oh, no. What was I going to say? So the Eisenhower speech is always remarkable to revisit. It's just, it's like how politicians used to speak. I always find it, to imagine a politician saying that today is just crazy. But I think like the important thing to understand is, as you pointed out, the incentives for the perpetuation of war are always going to be there once the war starts. It's relatively difficult for them to start the war, but then once it starts, the gravy train is rolling, baby, and it's really hard to stop it once it does. And that's just, and you see how effective they are at populating the important locuses of power in order to keep it going, whether it's the think tanks, which they get cushy, think tank jobs, whether it's the media, they often get cushy media jobs. Just look at, CNN at any given moment, the amount of like former, CIA generals, NatSec types that are just on the payroll is insane. And then this just the very idea that our quote unquote defense industry is private is something, something that Danny Bessner talks about a lot. It's just like, it's just so incompatible with any form of democratic governance in any meaningful way. All of these companies have essentially one client, the US government. So then what's the point of, the privatization of it? Like if they only have one client, like, something like 90% of their revenue comes from the US government, then that's just a transfer of wealth from public to private hands. There's just no other justification for it. Like on some level, if there was multiple clients and they're competing and all that stuff, like, okay, I get it. But they're not even doing that. They just have one client and that's all they're getting. So the privatization of war, which has been, started decades ago, but has accelerated dramatically in recent years, creates just a incredibly robust infrastructure of power to maintain wars, to fight clandestine wars that we don't even hear about half the time, that cost a bunch of money and manpower and weapons and all that stuff. And that's why the war machine rolls on. It's not that like the entire system. The entire system does benefit in some way from the maintenance of the empire, but the narrow profit interests, that it's just like once they get in the door, you can't get them out. They're like a house guest that you just can't get out of your house because they just know how to nuzzle in there and stay there forever.
Totally. And it's a vicious cycle because the narrow interests that we're talking about here are interests, but like they're the top moneyed interests. So when you look at the lobbying that they do on a yearly basis, but of course, especially during an election year, they're the top industry in terms of campaign donations to various politicians, both Democrat and Republican. And so what that does is, of course, corrupt the politicians. We know that, but it influences their own decision making into whether or not we engage in these wars, whether we intervene or not. And it's not just the campaign donations. Remember, I'm going to keep repeating this because this blows my mind every time I think about it. Members of Congress are allowed to invest in individual stocks. So if you're a shareholder for Boeing or for Northrop Grumman and some sort of conflict emerges and there's a question about whether or not the United States should get involved, they're going to want to get involved because they're going to see a return on their investment. It should absolutely be banned Okay,
Yeah.
members of Congress should not be invested in any individual stocks, period.
No, I remember when Trump bombed Syria, we talked about it earlier, it wasn't just the media that went, fully in lockstep, but the stock prices for all of these defense manufacturers just went through the roof, like through the roof. It's hard to not to sound like one of those guys where it's like, it's the corporations, man, but like, it kind of is. If you enjoyed this clip from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. You can also watch the full episode or catch any future live stream by clicking the join button below and becoming a Jacobin YouTube member. Thank you.